And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined in the special report by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Miss Olivia, all kinds of fun in the sky, it looks like. And, you know, this is very interesting coming on the heels of all those balloon reports. So we're going to get to the bottom of it tonight since it's been so active today and ties so deeply in with something we really keep a close eye on this program, which is the continuity of government UFO threat narrative, which you see coming out of a number of media companies and the government itself, and a lot of repeat offenders on the CIA side, the Elizondos of the world, the Jim Semivans, and these people who put together a narrative for a threat and tried to pull it off back in 2017 and have been constructing alternate versions of it ever since that period over 5 years. Of course, they were at it earlier, and they sketched this out a long time ago with the continuity of government factor and some of those emergency preparations that they were able to prepare in the continuity of government. I can't stress this enough. When you see COG people like General VanHerck sort of wandering around in the middle of a news cycle, watch out, because these are people who generally live in bunkers. And, you know, when Terence O'Shaughnessy came out and did something quite similar, you know, we had him doing his thing during the COVID crisis. This was also quite unusual. So it's a kind of an alarm bell right off the bat. But when you see actually VanHerck leading an operation to shoot down unidentified objects, you know you're in some process, you're in some piece of that COG UFO threat aspect. And we did have some shoot downs that we're going to go over in detail. And if we trek through that history, it's going to be very important to see how these things come about and how far back the planning goes, but also some of the real key telltale signs all the way back to the Roswell incident, which incidentally has a great deal to do with the activity and a lot of crossover that we're seeing, including the fact that the COG commander, the NORTHCOM commander, General VanHerck, who was also the NORAD commander, that's a triple play, he had quite a stint in the 509th group. And although, you know, he's too young to have been involved in the Roswell incident, that is the squadron that handled the Roswell wreckage. So there's a definite lineage there on the UFO side. We're going to try to get to as many as your questions as we can on the second half of the program tonight, too. We'll probably go about 90 minutes with this special report.
Sounds good.
And, you know, I appreciated it with Olivia because, you know, I said, well, we just ran the Gigi episode. I realized that. However, there is something going on. And she said, the UFO shoot down? And I said, yes. And she said, I'll be there. So thank you. Muchas gracias.
I'm happy to be here.
And thank you, everyone in the Ideas Room as well. Lots of great intel. I'll tell you, in a sense, the best way to solve and stay on top of all the aerospace hijinks that are going on is not the news by a long shot, but it is that person-to-person connection in the Ideas Room. And people who are in Montana who have seen things, and I've received some emails for you during the week. One of the things that was fascinating, before I get into the history of this and wrap it around to the big COG enchilada that we're walking into, is during the balloon, when it was that first China balloon came out, and they were letting it sort of wander across the United States, which is something that's never happened before. That was unusual enough, but there was this emphasis on Montana right away. And of course, we have the Malmstrom Air Force Base there, which participated in this very important 1967 UFO incident where a UFO hovered over it and shut the nukes down. There's another piece involving Montana that involves the belief in certain mystery circles that Livingston, Montana will someday feed the world. This is interesting as well. That comes directly out of the Edgar Cayce readings. There's a lot of interesting aspects around the Montana piece for us to be aware of. And of course, we have major nuclear bases there in Montana. So the idea of this balloon wandering over Montana and them being caught by surprise, no way. And Time Magazine, MSNBC, all that stuff. I read it all week and I read it today. And what they've been trying to tell us is, oh, they were caught off guard. And then they had the COG commander come out and say he was caught off guard. Absolutely ridiculous, by a balloon. And I'm going to show you why. But the balloon is important because it sets off all these other objects showing up. So we're going to sort of concentrate on this one. What's interesting also about the balloon piece is when it goes over North America and it's coming in, suddenly we get reports after it's left Montana of these sky flashes. And this actually happened to the governor of Montana while he was on air on Fox News. He was talking and they were saying, we're getting reports and seeing these, films of these sky flashes. And I looked at them and they were very, legit, ordinary people putting up footage. But it struck me that this is how we're, in a sense, we're going to get some answers on this. And they buried that story of the sky flashes very quickly, even though the governor was caught flat-footed on air. So I want to dispel just a couple of quick things right off the bat about the continuity of government NORAD line that they're feeding out, that, they were caught by surprise by these things, and, that they let this balloon go across America because they didn't know what else to do. Complete falsehood. And it's the instant signature of a kind of treachery going on in the background. And whether this is a performance drill to see how they can operate the system and see what kind of feedback they get, or if somebody was lunatic enough to go for the real thing and introduce a UFO threat and, introduce panic and things like that, remains to be seen. But it looks to me like a higher level trial run than we've seen before. And we're just in the kind of early stages of it. While, in the middle of all that, of course, there's the tension. There's the kind of theater of the tension with China. But the real tension going on, of course, is over Ukraine and Russia and our support of that war, and the escalation behind the scenes of these neocons who are very tied in with this UFO threat piece. And I think I can demonstrate all of that. Right off the bat, let's get to know some of the players here. Okay, you've got General VanHerck. Now, this is important about VanHerck here with the salute. Behind him is Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who gave up the position of the COG commander relatively shortly and was only 54 years old and retired out of the blue to install this 509th Bomb Squadron Roswell commander connection. A few things happened in the middle of all that, including the fact that during the end of the Trump administration, they were raising the idea of continuity of government may have to take over when he got COVID. And Trump, when the election was over, did the unusual step of firing the Defense Department Secretary, Mark Esper. Now, this was a weird thing to do and it doesn't happen very often. I can tell you that when your administration's over, people leave, but you don't walk around firing people. Even if you're Trump, it's a little odd. One of the things that had happened was that O'Shaughnessy got switched out for this other commander, VanHerck, in the middle of all that. Now, my own feeling about this, and this is interesting too, because Esper came out and spoke during this whole thing that was going on when they were saying, oh, you know what, there have been other balloons in our airspace during the Trump administration too. And Mark Milley just didn't want to say it to Trump because he didn't want him to go after the Chinese and be the bad guy. Absolutely ridiculous. So you're getting a lot of lies and living in lies going on in the media. No great surprise. But Esper came out and said, I didn't get any reports of that. Where are you getting that from? Now that's interesting because he's the defense secretary and he's no friend of Trump. That's for sure. So why is he coming out and saying, oh, that line is a lot of BS? But the COG commander, VanHerck is coming out and saying, yeah, we did, we missed a lot of those balloons, and that's because we just couldn't cover the airspace. Absolutely ridiculous. NORAD is like a tight drum. Anytime anything goes up, they're aware of it. And many of the studies that we found just from the satellites is that they can read a license plate. Starting in the 1980s, they could read a license plate underground in Russia. All right, so they can definitely detect a balloon. Some of this has to be, we need to supply the history real quick on this. In Japan, during World War II in America, we had these Japanese balloons come over loaded with explosives. And in some of the instances, they actually killed people. So this is of course, that's the China balloon that we got earlier. Very strangely, we let it wander all the way across the US before it got destroyed in South Carolina, the first shoot down. But there's a whole book on this I've been reading, Japan's World War II balloon bomb attacks on North America. We had tons of them. And we developed protocols that anytime a balloon came forward, we would tell the nation involved, we consider it a provocation and we'll send missiles your way if you do it. That's a protocol based on World War II activity of Japan while we were at war. So, 75, 80 years later, you're not going to say, oh, we just forgot about these balloons. So the story complete out of the Smithsonian. In 1945, a Japanese balloon bomb actually killed 6 Americans, 5 of them children, in Oregon. So this is on record. We developed the policy, we had balloon bomb attacks, and so we became very paranoid about the airspace. After events like the Cold War that happened during the Cold War, and then ultimately 9/11, you can imagine that air defense absolutely paranoid about anything entering under any conditions that they're not aware of. So the first thing that we have then is a lie on behalf of the COG NORAD NORTHCOM commander. Now, I want to stress, too, that in the event of an emergency, like a UFO threat, it is the continuity of government commander who takes over the United States. And he becomes the NORTHCOM combatant commander. And he secures things until there can be an election, sometime in the 22nd century. So this is a very dangerous setup that we have with continuity of government, and it's been allowed to grow and fester, much like the Central Intelligence Agency. And some of that with the UFO threat piece may be, this may be coming home to roost because it is something that is unchecked power and there's no oversight. And I'm going to get into, how that operates. Even in the Washington Post and New York Times, we have headlights about these documents dealing with COG. Here's what they'll say about them. Documents shed light on secret U.S. plans for apocalyptic scenarios. Dating back to the 1950s, preparations for nuclear war were revised after the September 11th attacks. The presidential directives are not shown to Congress. Underline not. So who does the oversight if it's not Congress on behalf of the American people? We have to rely on 10 to 12 national security individuals. That's a very dangerous situation right off the bat. So that gives us a little context going in. Let's go for more context. After the China balloon thing, the Biden administration was getting hassled because this had never happened in American history before, where we had a balloon wander across our airspace and go unchallenged. We watched it come in, we watched it sail over, we watched it go out, and then we blew it up, which doesn't make any sense. Now, some of the stories about it also are unusual, and we're going to get into those. But something strange came up because immediately they started to try to bail out in the media Stepford Biden. And they said, well, it happened in the Trump administration too. And Trump said, no, it didn't. If they had done that, I would have blown it out of the sky. And we know Trump, and he would have. That wouldn't have been any big surprise. However, he was contradicted by the continuity of government combatant commander, VanHerck, who said, oh, no, we did. We did. And then the former defense secretary said, wait a minute, I didn't hear anything about this. What are you talking about? And then there was some other story that was floated about General Milley not wanting to have Trump respond to the Chinese who are just not telling him. Well, that's treason. So if you want to stick to that story, fine, but have fun at Gitmo. So these are weird. These are already weird tales that are coming up in relation to this, and they're putting the NORTHCOM commander as the authority in the middle of it, and he as the emerging COG commander of the United States. They want to try to lend him this authority. All right, so a little further before we get to the shoot downs from today and all that, which I have all those here, but a couple more things in relation to this. So back during the whole Roswell incident in 1947, it was considered at the time when it happened as an attempt, as a sky attempt around our nuclear bases, because the 509th group that ran the base in Roswell, they were the squadron that handled the atomic bomb, and Jesse Marcel was their intelligence officer. So that's the only squadron that was allowed the atomic bomb at the time. And remember that just before that, 1946, we had there were only 7 nuclear bombs in the whole world. So we're talking about a very small elite group. So by the time you get to 47, maybe there's a few more. But the tie over here is the 509th group. Jesse Marcel is the one who discovered the UFO wreckage from the Roswell crash, and his 509th unit is the lineage for the COG commander that we have now. It's a very important symbolic fingerprint, I think, as we're going to find out also is the case with the leader of the Space Force. And we're going to get into that in just a second. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report, Shootdown. This is the COG UFO Threat. We're going to take some of your questions in the second half and the last half hour here. And we'll do, we'll go till maybe a little before 11 o'clock Eastern. It's great to have so many of you here with us. I wanted to make sure, we had this incredible interview with Gigi Young that we put out last night, and just a great response on that. And all these things started to happen in relation to this. And it's funny because, as happens very often with Gigi interviews, there's a lot in there that sound like, we're talking about events before they happen. And so there's a good deal in that was a setup for this. And so when these things started to happen, I thought that we were going to have to dig in and really drill down on this continuity of government UFO threat piece. We've done a number of programs on it last year, and I have to say, I think it's one of the central things that we're dealing with right out of the gate as we open up here. This is the thing. This is what they wanted to start the year off with. Reminds me very much of when they started off in February of 2020 with the COVID stories, so whatever it is that they're up to here, they're doing a replay. It's early in the year and has to play itself out. But they are involving the previous administration, NORTHCOM, continuity of government, and, a lot of the kind of CIA people who are promoting the COG UFO threat idea. This piece has to be brought forward in a very specific way and get past the personalities on it, so that when we're dealing around the UFO file, and this whole thing about transparency in media, if some of those shows that are claiming to do this on the mainstream level, and we've seen a lot of astroturfing for topics, but if they start calling in COG and CIA people to give us feedback on this stuff, then we know that it's just completely unacceptable. And that's a very important point when I get to about transparency this year, the potency aspect of the reports you get. And what happens in a situation like this is we can't have the fluffy people, reporting around on this, like a Megyn Kelly or a Tucker Carlson type situation, because they're going to be talking to a bunch of CIA people who are giving them talking points around the UFO threat. And the UFO threat has to be dealt with by people who understand the people who are involved in the threat and are promoting the threat. And, we do it on this show. Certainly, we have people on this show who address it correctly. So we need that kind of coherence around it, or else you're going to get a real CIA narrative mess going, and they're going to be pulling the threat thing and they're going to have us shooting at our own drones and pretending it's a major UFO threat. It's very interesting, some pieces that are running under the surface on this as well. So I'm going to get to a few of those right now. What are the chances that General Chance Saltzman would be heading up the Space Force? Did you like that one? Chance is an interesting guy. He actually went to school here at Boston University, not so far away, and rose fast in the ranks. And he was appointed as the head of Space Force, which, President Trump actually created Space Force, but Biden, who hasn't spent a lot of time doing much with it, put Chance in as his main man. Interestingly enough, Chance had another little stint in his career that went on close to a decade, and it was at Malmstrom Air Force Base, the same base that we started the show off with that had the weird incident in 1967 regarding UFOs and the nuclear shutdown. And of course, those Chinese balloons, the first thing that when they sailed through, they were close enough to Malmstrom. There's another report that we're going to get to tonight about something that just happened about them closing the airspace in Montana. But hold that thought just for a minute. So Saltzman has the signature of the Malmstrom Air Force Base, which had a major UFO component. Then we have General VanHerck, who has a major Roswell signature. Kind of interesting. It's almost like they need something that connects them to major UFO incidents in order to deal with the UFO threat narrative. And by the way, for my money, what they're putting together is false. It's a manufactured threat. It is not real. And it's very important for us to get on that side of it right off the bat, because, they've been planning for a UFO threat as a way of initiating emergency precautions. The COVID thing was a piece of this. And it's interesting enough that in the middle of the COVID op, they were rolling out all of this stuff that they had already revealed in 2017, the whole bad story about Lou Elizondo being a whistleblower and leaving the Pentagon, and how he really wanted that government to give us the truth and all that stuff. And, they had the Tic Tac video and all this nonsense. Interestingly enough, as we've exposed on this show, the Tic Tac video, a lot of that stuff came out on YouTube in 2007. So much for classified videos. But it is interesting the way that it was pushed. And now when we look at the people who positioned it, that is the story of Elizondo, TTSA, and that whole malarkey from December of 2017, the same people are on the front lines of the Chinese shootdown story. Okay, so this is getting interesting. And also, what just happened in Canada, the people reporting on it for the New York Times, it's the same group. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them as well. Let's get, since I mentioned Chance, let's get a couple of things on the record regarding Chance. And my notes are going to be really a little bit wild tonight. Now, here's what's interesting. The Space Force decided on a whim to go over there and visit Malmstrom. It's kind of like we really want to buck you guys up after this little incident. That was interesting, as was the fact that General VanHerck from Continuity of Government and NORAD met with Justin Trudeau back in June. And he was there with his defense minister, and VanHerck was there with our defense secretary. Now, I'm going to kind of cut this into two pieces, but this is basically Justin Trudeau today. U.S. jets shoot down flying object over Canada. And we kept having these comments about Justin Trudeau said, I'm going to shoot down this thing. Well, it was the American jets that did it. And what they did in the call is they said, we're going to be over that space because, NORAD handles Canada and the U.S. And, they took down this object, whatever it is. Now, this is the object from today that was over Canada. So I've skipped one in between the big balloon and this one. And that was the one that we shot down over Alaska, which has a really weird signature to it. They were saying that, hey, this thing looks like a small car. What's that about? No obvious means of propulsion. That's interesting. I will read the actual reports on it, but I'm going to do kind of a capsule review and then we'll get into it. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada at an event, I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. Okay, now everybody, after letting the Chinese balloon sail over with no opposition, suddenly are acting like Dirty Harry, right? Oh, I shut this down. I'm making it happen. Anytime you see Trudeau in the mix, and I realize that it happened over his airspace, but it's not a good sign. This is the guy who pressed the emergency button on the truckers. We have to remember this is the guy who said, people who aren't vaccinated take up space and we shouldn't tolerate them and all this kind of Nazi rhetoric. So he and Chrystia Freeland are, sort of the World Economic Forum puppets that are placed there, and Canada is under siege in the middle of all this. We have to keep that in mind. Okay, Montana. Let's see here. So here's a couple of interesting things. Montana's 150 missile sites in line for replacement as Chinese spy balloon questions remain. Montana's missile wing at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls is responsible for 150 launch facilities. Well, suddenly, as soon as this thing came up, they were like, let's modernize them all a lot quicker, like a year in advance. That's interesting. Now, we mentioned that there's a lot of incidents that happened today, but let's keep this thing in mind that the actual balloon came in through Montana from Canada, one. Then there was the weirdness of the sky flashes in Montana. Then we have this thing about modernizing the nukes in Montana. So in the middle of all this, we get this unusualness. Yesterday, U.S. shoots down another high-flying object. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said the aircraft was brought down Friday afternoon. We remember this very unusual press conference where he just didn't say anything but wanted to talk tough, after they had let this, balloon wander through our airspace. Now, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is one of the ones who got us this UAP UFO office in the government, which is set to rake in all these defense contractor dollars. And she was shrewd enough with Marco Rubio to include it as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, I've mentioned before how the NDAA connects with this continuity of government program. They're linked because every time the president signs the National Security NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, he has to sign on to the September 11th emergency powers, which keep us under a September 11th emergency with NORTHCOM technically in charge. Now, in the middle of this balloon nonsense, she comes out and tweets, "This is why I've fought so hard to increase interagency cooperation and to reduce stigma around reporting UAPs. How about the stigma of saying UFO? When we treat our service members with respect to take the reports seriously, our nation is safer. Previous Chinese balloon incursions initially went undetected. Some earlier incidents have been classified as unexplained phenomena." And this is, again, completely contested by the previous administration. But there's Gillibrand, who got the UFO office going, and now she's sort of patting herself on the back in the middle of the balloon thing. Now, the whole balloon thing, along with these other objects, is to legitimize the AIMSOG UAP task force piece inside the government and fund them dramatically and give them powers so that they can take emergency powers at a certain point. And just to kind of get us on the, kind of incredulous side, really look at this balloon path wandering. And again, it starts up there in Montana here. We get it across, and if you really look at this, just imagine this thing kind of wandering across with God knows what in it. And it could have been nuclear material in it. And it's just wandering across the United States. That was the first kind of freak out sign of the whole thing, because something was not quite right immediately with that, and then our response to it as we went. So in all of these major stories today, this morning, talking about, oh, there's an object over Canada and we're getting ready to shoot that one down. We already shot this other thing down, which, by the way, looked like a small car. It's interesting because if you go into some of the early UFO reports, you're going to find this description of a small car as well. It's interesting. Gigi Young picked up on this and said, the Lonnie Zamora, New Mexico sighting, that one, that's the description of it. It looked like a small car. But suddenly, instead of showing, Biden, Stepford Biden or somebody else when they mention another high altitude object spotted, who are we seeing in news reports? It's our friend General VanHerck. General VanHerck can be counted on in a moment of crisis. He's handling these threats from the UFO skies. The UAP threat, the UFO threat, is going to be handled by the NORTHCOM commander. That's the message that we're getting. And he's getting an awful lot of attention, which is unusual. Now, I understand he represents NORAD and he's involved in the shootdowns. But nonetheless, you would think, okay, you've got Biden huddling with his advisors, figuring out what to do. How about Lloyd Austin? He's the defense secretary of the United States. Does he have anything to say about this? So instantly, we're getting all kinds of weirdness about our COG commander. Remember, if there's an emergency, continuity of government button gets pressed, he becomes the combatant commander of the United States and assigns to regional governors various powers for martial law. And then they are supposed to institute that until conditions are, back to the strategic situation, and then we can have elections again. Those are the odds and the chips that those guys play with. Interestingly enough, I also want to get inside somebody like VanHerck's head. I've read a lot about continuity of government, and what they plan for is for them to survive after a massive nuclear explosion. And they have to select, kind of the fit members of society and who is designated to go on. So let's get ourselves in their head a little bit when they're dealing with the UFO threat thing. Any person who's in that position, you have to say, well, it's their job to think like that. Yes, true. But nonetheless, they have to think like that. So therefore, when we're looking at them, we're looking at people who are planning for continuity of government. They're planning to take over, and they're planning to select who should survive, and and they're planning martial law. That's what their job is. So therefore, that faction which exists out there has to be handled with major oversight from a civilian authority, or else we get ourselves into trouble. And this is something that comes up in a historical track again. And I've pointed it out where, President Kennedy was very aware of this. And he said that there was a book that came out in 1960 called 7 Days in May. And when he got into office, he said, this is so much like what happens here that they're making this movie now. I'm going to give them the White House to shoot in. And his own notes to his aides and said, I want everyone to know what actually goes on behind closed doors. And it's that there are these groups, these kind of like doomsday groups inside the government on the intel side and on the military side, and they want to seize power. And the president is always operating, one step ahead of them to prevent that from happening. But, I can't believe in assuming the presidency that this is what goes on. It's interesting because President Kennedy, who we've brought up before in relation to the UFO threat aspect, he understood what they would do with it and said, what would happen and what we need to prevent is that the Cold Warriors inside the government would seize upon this idea of a need for increased security and get rid of all the traditions of free speech and freedom in general in the United States. So he set the tone, and as we've put forward in this program, his own policies towards being open with the UFO file and sharing it with the Russians, etc., is part of the pattern of his elimination. That piece as we move from the 40s into the 60s and seeing how this thing progresses, and then the gigantic overhaul of continuity of government that happens under the Reagan administration in the 80s is also crucial, because it's accompanied by Star Wars. And Star Wars is a program that on its face says, I'm going to be able to shoot out a nuclear missile that's aimed at the United States. But underneath, the idea is I can prevent a UFO from taking over because I have this shoot down system. So it serves two purposes. They called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. When we track it this way, we start to understand it, because there is no feasible on the record piece about how the UFO file and the continuity of government emergency idea merged. And that's something that we've, kind of got from the deep state aspects of really great deep state researchers like Peter Dale Scott, understanding continuity of government, but having nothing to do with UFOs. I've had great conversations with the professor, and I think he understands the political system better than anybody and how it operates. But I've pointed out before that the nature of the field of UFOs doesn't lend itself to the deep scholarly aptitude of like Professor Scott. And I think that the people who are great deep state researchers don't want anything to do with the UFO file. However, it's no longer something that can remain separate in terms of a research study, because the deep state, that whole piece holds the UFO file. So the UFO researchers need to, the genuine ones, there's so much in the field, as we've pointed out, that gets into this kind of circus activity, and it doesn't lend itself, it's the same people who are like, oh, the government's holding records from us on the UFO truth. And then as soon as the CIA comes in, it's like, hey, we're doing documentaries. They're like, count me in. So there's a problem there. There's not a lot of serious people in the UFO field. I can tell you that for a fact. But I will say there's an opportunity to take the UFO file and to come in with the deep state government research mindset and to understand the UFO file piece. And that's something I think we can do here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight on these UFO shoot downs, the continuity of government, UFO threat. We're going to be taking your questions in about a half hour here, and we'll go for about another hour tonight. Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. Chief Zitwish Wind Eater says, did they wait to shoot down the first balloon to make sure as many people paying attention as possible? Then once everyone is looking, they start shooting down, quote, UFOs, Project Bluebeam style?
Yeah, I don't think there's any logic to how they've done this, but I will say this. And of course, Bluebeam is the idea that the government would fake their own alien invasion. And it's not so much that Bluebeam exists, it's that, there's enough kind of street legend about them planning this, an Operation Northwoods type thing involving UFOs, where they would do a false flag alien invasion, and that they have a plan for it. You bet they have a plan for it. They've had a plan for that since the 1940s. But the way that it's achieved, and, the kind of complete aspect of emergency control, is something that they would need a lot of public feedback on. So in a sense, you do get that, as you're saying, from the balloon story. Although there's nothing simple or pat about how they're handling the UFO threat thing. And that's because when you see continuity of government involved, it means the stakes are moved higher, even if it's a drill. On the UFO threat side, those are the people who have the authority, which is something that should really be revised dramatically, because it's not constitutional authority at all, to take over an elected government in an emergency. So a very interesting thing happened, and this is because of the work of Professor Scott. We've learned this, and his deep. Let me tell you something. When I was reading Professor Scott's work, An American Deep State is one of his greatest books. And I was, every year we did a couple of interviews, and we had long conversations, and I followed his work since I was in college. But his stuff, And what he would get to and what he brought forward is, look, we have this whole division of continuity of government. Nobody knows anything about it. And, the only people who write about it in depth and have good facts about it leave out all the main players like Dick Cheney and others who formulated it and put it together. So continuity of government initially structured during the 40s and 50s to survive a nuclear attack. And they had the secrecy protocols in place because they thought, hey, if the government gets decapitated in a nuclear strike, then we are going to have plans for an underground government. And they amassed tremendous resources to make that happen. Interestingly enough, around the period of the Kennedy assassination, they started to use this doomsday network. And they used the doomsday network when they set up the motorcade route for the Kennedy trip. And one of the patterns that Professor Scott noticed was before any major deep event in the United States, there was always a COG person involved. And if you go back and you look at the various things like the Kennedy assassination, Watergate with John Dean, who had just come forward after working for COG and become the lawyer of the president. And if you go further into Cheney and Rumsfeld, they had designed, even when they weren't in government, they were designing the continuity of government program. And that is a massive, and I mean massive, underground control structure with cities and, all sorts of things that we've never get to see, even though we pay for it. And so at a certain point in there, the oversight ended, and this became a really big problem. And how do you oversight an emergency program of that size? And so the various pieces of the continuity of government program started to grow larger and larger. And by the 80s, they said, you know what? We don't need this. When we rewrite the protocol for continuity of government, we're going to change a few things. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to include a provision that it's any emergency, that it's not a nuclear emergency that causes COG, it's any emergency. So, if the people riot against the government, that's an emergency. COG takes over. Whatever it happens to be. An earthquake, COG is there, baby. So, they had this aspect going on. They wrote that in. It was not in there. It's completely unconstitutional from the original thought, which was just to survive a nuclear war, which under Eisenhower and people like that made sense, with their military training. Now we go a few years beyond that, and then they say, well, we had a lot of problems during the Vietnam War with the peace movement. And the major problem was that mass of people prevented us from doing things militarily that we wanted to do. Let's do this. Let's create a list inside of the continuity of government program of the first people we'll grab in the event of this emergency. So they set up and they ran through a program, and they called it Rex 84 at the time in the 1980s. And the idea was that we went to war with El Salvador, and there was a massive protest on behalf of Central Americans and American citizens who had Central American ancestry. So they set up a whole program about how to round them up and keep them in large facilities during hostilities. This piece became a core aspect of the continuity of government program as it graduated out. And by the time we got to 9/11, in fact, you will see that the Patriot Act and all of these things that Cheney and Rumsfeld activated, they were the original architects of COG back in the 1980s. So when they show up during the 9/11 attacks, which were highly suspicious, as we know, what is it that takes place there? Well, it's very interesting. They actually activate continuity of government for a short period of time. And Cheney goes, into the mountain and he comes back out with the Patriot Act. He's like, hey, he wrote this incredible thing in just a couple of weeks. How'd you do that? Well, they had it on the books since the 1980s. So all of those things that we got, TSA and, the real hardcore stripping of rights, that all came out of this era of the September 11th emergency attacks, directly related to continuity of government. Now, the program has grown, but it still used to be the kind of thing which you couldn't even mention. And the fact that it came up in loose talk in places like Newsweek and other places during the 2020 election, meant that they were in the background there planning on some idea that they could not go through another populist election with Trump and have him come up there and carry on his policies of a strong border and being tough with China and all the rest of it. They needed to get rid of that. And one of the ways that they thought about doing it was using COVID as the emergency to do it. And there was a lot of loose talk, and the NORTHCOM commander at the time was O'Shaughnessy, and he came out and did it. So now let's take all that information and bring it around to the situation that we're in today. So now we have in the background since 2017 this idea of a UFO threat that has been built up. We know that the main players were the people in the To the Stars Academy, which had CIA leadership. You know, Tom DeLonge was the functionary head, but he's basically the Bobo, and the CIA always has a Bobo when they do these things because they need a front man. But if you look carefully at the leadership as we did, you'll find that all the main members were all CIA people. So that UFO threat piece was necessary as an idea to get an emergency going that could trigger the continuity of government program. The COVID emergency, they kind of went through the motions of it, and we're still in bizarre territory with it. Let's face it, you know, and with the biometric rules that are coming in. And, you know, this is definitely putting us on a war footing with the people who are implementing it. But the UFO threat is very unique in this sense, and it's something that's worldwide, and it's something where you know, you could galvanize all these forces to take on this, you know, menace of this UFO threat. And it's something that they've also been working on and started to spray through the media starting in 2017. It was unusual. And for those of us who are aware of the UFO file and the amount of secrecy and holding it down and not talking about it or making light of it, started to see that this is a very, very strange trend indeed. So let's take that up to what happened today. Well, as I mentioned now, Trudeau, who in participation with our COG commander, supposedly, you know, the US government shot down this thing with his permission. Here he is, June of 2022, with the COG commander and with Lloyd Austin and his own defense person. Here's another shot of those guys together. Interesting salute there by our friend General VanHerck. But this meeting, literally, that took place at NORAD could have been, look, in 6 or 7 months, we're going to run through this thing about a UAP threat. You're going to be involved, and here's the way that it's going to go. And all of these details of everything that we're seeing laid out could have all been planned out back in June. We need to keep that in mind as, you know, we get news events and the news cycle kicks in, that some of these things may not be organic happenings. But just for the record, June 7th, 2022 is when that took place. It's Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau and Secretary Austin visit NORAD. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Canadian Defense Minister Anita Anand met with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at North American Aerospace Defense Command. Given the fact that they tried during the COVID op to push their own emergency powers and the whole, you know, trucker thing that took place in Canada and the language that he used, I think it's very important that he is also a leading face of this whole shoot-down thing activity that we're seeing. Here's his tweet from today. I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. Actually, all he did was agree to it. He didn't order anything. NORAD command shut down the object over the Yukon. Now, it was an interesting thing, like Yukon, again, very hard to get any details on it. For all we know, like, we have no idea, in fact, what happened there. That's pretty remote. Canadian and U.S. aircraft were scrambled, and a U.S. F-22 successfully fired at the object. I spoke with President Biden this afternoon. Canadian forces will now recover and analyze the wreckage. So we've got Trudeau highly untrustworthy right in the middle of this. It's another red flag for the aerospace activity that we're seeing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here deep now in the UFO Shootdown, going over the details and doing kind of a quick capsule version of the continuity of government program to catch everybody up to speed. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And like I said, I think we'll go till about 11 o'clock.
Okay.
How you doing out there?
Doing great. Everybody was talking about the Super Bowl tomorrow. So Summer La Liberté says, great halftime entertainment incoming tomorrow.
Well, isn't that true? I'm sure that, Lady Gaga, or who are they doing for music?
It's Rihanna.
Oh, okay.
But interesting enough, No Rush at For Life says, ChatGPT says tomorrow, 212, will change humanity.
Why is that?
Well, I guess we have to live to find out, right? We can guess. Shashakila says, balloons in Super Bowl tomorrow. Coincidence? Predictive programming from 1970s. Check out Black Sunday. The roof at stadium will be open. Super Bowl crisis while most of America watches the new 9/11.
Interesting. Well, I would never want to project anything like that on any event, but I hear you. I mean, I understand where you're coming from.
It would be masterfully theatrical.
Ain't that the truth? No, that's just the kind of, I'm sure that the false flag aspect around the UFO file is something where they would need the world's eyes trained on them. I want to go through a couple of inconsistencies in the reporting that I mentioned. Here's the first big red flag, and it was a pretty lengthy article in Time magazine. And Sanya Mansour is she was the writer, and this came out yesterday, and it was called "Why America's Air Defense Network Failed to Detect the Chinese Spy Balloons." Look, I don't know how you can be a journalist at a major magazine and think that our aerospace systems and defenses, which have been built to survive nuclear war, nuclear attack, 9/11, the Cold War, need I go on, and all the advances that we don't even see, that you could honestly believe that a balloon could get across our border without us noticing. It's absurd. So here's the opening of this, and I think, here's the narrative that they want to spin on some of this. Oh, we were caught by surprise, and all these other objects were getting caught by surprise. Here's the article, quote, since the earliest days of the Cold War, the U.S. military has been monitoring the skies over North America, ever vigilant for a sneak attack. Apparently not. The task falls to U.S. Northern Command and North American Aerospace Command, NORAD, to identify and track potential threats before they even cross into our airspace, be they Russian bombers or North Korean ballistic missiles. So how did it miss at least 4 Chinese balloons that had entered U.S. airspace in recent years? Here's the false story, that these things came in during the Trump administration. No, to just kind of normalize this whole thing. No, it's very strange, and we didn't have them. They didn't cross over into American territory. As a matter of fact, when pressed, the Defense Department officials who were supposedly supporting this never came forward and said, did they come within the 12-mile limit that considers it inside the United States airspace? Or were they just right outside of it? And they just wouldn't answer the question. So obviously these things never actually got in. And if they had, the Trump administration would have blown them up. General VanHerck, NORAD's commander, admitted the balloons exposed a gap in American air defenses. Quote, I will tell you that we did not detect those threats, he said. Okay, so he's using the word threat there, and he's saying we didn't detect those balloon threats. So he should just resign then, if that were true, but it's not. And this is the weirdness of VanHerck and the media and how they're positioning this is something that they didn't foresee. I can tell you 100% that they understood where any balloon was anywhere, and the things that they can see, forget it. I hear all this talk about, bury your money in the desert or like live in a bunker or whatever. Look, with the kind of infrared stuff that they had, satellites, GPS, low Earth orbit stuff, there's no place to hide. This is my conversation with Bobby Kennedy from last year. He said, there used to be a way you could kind of go run for the hills and hide it. You can't do that anymore. We have to get our heads wrapped around that. And it's interesting because, a lot of people are like, well, I'm, preparing for the future doing that. Look, you have to either create a civilization that is complementary to humanity by participating in it, or it's not going to happen. And the idea that you'll hide away in some bunker, with stacks of silver and gold and ammo, sorry, that's not going to do it. You have a participatory culture. It's good to be prepared for anything. I think people should stock up on food and everything else. And, gold and silver and all that stuff's great, but it doesn't substitute for a civilization. That stuff, a lot of it also are marketing programs who know, hey, when things get tense, people tend to go into this stuff. I do think that more people who are on the independent media side should speak more accurately about things of this nature and not pretend that you can kind of escape to some bunker. Although, it's a nice idea. All right. The Pentagon has not released many details of any of the other balloons. And what's interesting, it says other balloons. There's a lot of weird things. He says later, VanHerck says in the same article, he says, responsibly responsible. Here we have other. Now, they could be just bad typos, sure, but it gets weird.
Or he's glitching.
I was 200 on the one that was spotted, the Chinese balloon spotted in Montana, February 1st, was 200 feet tall and carried a payload of sensors and other equipment. The balloon sparked a crisis after it lingered near sensitive U.S. nuclear missile sites before wafting off into the middle of the continental U.S. Well, if you got something like that around a nuclear base, do you think not doing anything about it would even be an option? This reminds me of when they did the 9/11 story and they said, oh, there was a plane heading into the Pentagon, and all the horror of this story. But look, there are rules in place around the Pentagon that, they have all kinds of defenses, including machine guns and anti-aircraft guns on the top of the Pentagon. That's what it's built for. It's built to survive people doing things like that. You can't bicycle too close to the Pentagon without people grabbing it. So the idea that there was going to be a plane that would fly into it, it's just not realistic. So just like that, this comes up short. They would never allow a foreign balloon to go across the border and then linger over nuclear sites. So already we're getting spins of lies. And the person who's trying to reassure that the lies are real is the COG commander. That's not good because, first of all, the COG commander is a hidden individual. Usually he's somebody who hangs out, controlling things in the bunker, and he doesn't give interviews except once in a while, sometimes, under very stressful circumstances, perhaps. But, the fact that he's out there and, touting this whole thing is one of the first bad signs. That was Time magazine. Okay. The Biden whole back and forth saying that, oh, we were keeping an eye on it the whole time was also weird. And there were a lot of Republicans and even some Democrats who were like, what are you talking about? How did this thing get across the United States? What's going on here? And what they did was they came out with these phony stories about, oh, they happen, they go across the United States all the time. It happened during Trump too. That got knocked down by the Trump officials. So what's going on? Why are they doing it this way? They're trying to normalize the idea of these objects. Now they're showing up and saying, hey, these objects showed up and we shot them down, so they're taking a tough approach to these things and they're seeing what kind of responses they get from that. The extent of the objects, that is the balloon coming in, number one, number two, us shooting down an object over Alaska that they said was the size of a small car, and now this third one that happened in Justin Trudeau's backyard. There's a pattern that's developing here, and they're not saying, hey, we shot down a drone, and they're not saying that these things are balloons. So they're leaving open the idea that they are unidentified flying objects. Therefore, they are test running the continuity of government UFO threat by saying continuity of government, NORAD just shot down a UFO, instead of saying there was a Chinese drone over Chinese airspace, over Canadian airspace, and we shot it down. So that's a dangerous thing, a game that they're playing right in the middle of the public sphere. And, as we went live on air here, they had shut down, I'd actually even printed this one out. They shut down the airspace over Montana because, of the idea, well, there's something else happening. We don't know what it is. Unidentified object detected over northern Montana. This thing was 57 minutes before I started. So they had another object up there. And again, we've got Montana in action. Now, if somebody in the ideas room has an update on that one, feel free to lay it on us here live.
Mr. Wolf has one.
What does he say?
There was a congressman that confirmed on Fox News that he was briefed that an object was confirmed over Montana, that the reason for reopening the airspace is because they cannot effectively take it down in the dark.
Ever hear of infrared?
I know. Provoked Patriot says, so a third object over Montana now, but due to darkness, they're leaving it alone until morning? What? What about night vision goggles?
Boy, I don't know. We might have to take over our national defenses. Here's some other just bits that are floating around in the news on this. Republicans react to third object shot down over Canada. Unprecedented challenge. And these are the headlines that are floating. NORAD statement on the object over Canada. Military aircraft are currently operating from Alaska and Canada in support of North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD activities. NORAD confirms the shoot down. So these stories have been around, and we're going to be all weekend being hit in one way or another with these. The thrust of it, though, if we really, put ourselves in the middle of this, is unidentified flying objects, the continuity of government NORAD commanders shooting them down, and this kind of unsteady where they're not giving us any facts about it and the explanations don't hold up. So you're left with a situation of thinking this is a dry run for the UFO threat continuity of government play. That's what we're in the middle of. This is the reason why we need a really good handle on what they plan to do, because once they seize those emergency powers, they don't give them back. As we found out with COVID, there was a certain point where it just felt like the pushback was developing to such an extent on the ground in relation to it that the really crazy factions that were inside this thing said we have to back off. And but before that, you were looking at leaders like Trudeau saying we should just eliminate these people. You could just start to put on the little Hitler mustache. Okay, reading a little more about this now. Let's see. We went over those 3 incidents. I wanted to take us back to the Roswell incident. Remember, our friend VanHerck comes directly out of the 5 and 9th group, as I mentioned. Now, he's 60 years old. He is the NORTHCOM commander. I want to mention this about NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM runs the United States. I'll tell you why that's true. NORTHCOM, before NORTHCOM, we had the police and federal authorities and things of this nature. NORTHCOM is a military unit that is set up to control the United States in a state of emergency. Now, we are technically under a state of emergency from the September 11th attacks, and every president, be he Bush, Obama, Biden, or Trump, signs on to that National Defense Authorization Act every year that says, oh yeah, we still want that September 11th emergency powers piece there. So every time they do that, they're signing on to this complete continuity of government emergency system. So NORTHCOM comes into play. What is NORTHCOM? NORTHCOM didn't even exist before 9/11. And, we had a Southern Command that was monitoring South America for drug running and things like that. And they came up with this idea, hey, we'll create NORTHCOM, Northern Command, and then we'll put them in charge of everything, literally. And it's a highly unconstitutional military takeover of a military unit that's just set up to cause martial law, under the appropriate emergency circumstance. However, since we're under this September 11th emergency attack, the NORTHCOM can take liberties with the Constitution. That's where you get so much of the domestic terrorist, this whole thing about, oh, well, the FBI is holding all these records on everyone. They've created these scenarios where, they have a get out of jail free card with something like NORTHCOM. When you look at NORTHCOM, it's an entirely unconstitutional structure. The head of NORTHCOM is the same VanHerck, because the way that they've done this, and it's quite interesting, the person who heads NORAD and is the head of NORTHCOM is the COG combatant commander of the United States. This is very important. Therefore, the person themselves, whatever we may think of their abilities or their character, even if they're a great guy, they need to be completely investigated and sussed out as to where their loyalties are, and what could, because of the amount of power that holds. This idea that a group inside the government would seize power using an emergency excuse has been going on in America for a number of years. One of the things I pointed out was that thing about JFK and 7 Days in May. But here's another hint, and I think that the 509th piece is going to actually come in handy when we look at this. The movie 7 Days in May, one of the interesting things that they did, and remember, Kennedy was entirely behind the development of the film and wanted to make sure, even lending the White House to see that it got done. The commander, the COG commander, Burt Lancaster plays, he's taking over, and for a weak president who he doesn't think is, he's negotiating a weak strategy with the Russians. So he's going to take over from a desert base. And the desert base, they show up on this board, and at the top here, it says Roswell. Now, that is a 1963 movie. Now, this is really interesting because the Roswell incident, although we know so much about it now, actually nobody knew anything about it, because it showed up on the radar for a day in 1947 and then was completely forgotten until Jesse Marcel came out in 1978 and told the story to Stanton Friedman. So what is it doing on the top of the COG map? This is very compelling in terms of what they were trying to get across with the movie. And in fact, the COG general tries to take over from the weak president, and he has a whole plan in order to do this by utilizing the base in the desert. So the director using Roswell there means if he's getting the intel from the Kennedy side, Kennedy is saying, the group that's operating continuity of government, somehow this thing is tangled up with the Roswell case. Now, for me, the amount of secrecy that's necessary for them to run the UFO file the way that they wanted to creates a secondary government. So therefore, the continuity of government rules being utilized for UFO threat makes a lot of sense, because they can call a national emergency and be totally legit under the circumstances. With something that is completely secret, like the UFO file. So how do you do that? How do you pull that off? If you look at the amount of secrecy that we've had around the UFO file and the groups that I've identified that are in the government, one being the X-Share group, which is a group that involved people like Kennedy and Thomas Townsend Brown, who wanted to bring the technology out into the culture and move the culture forward with it. The other group, X-Protect, are the same people who've orchestrated on the intelligence side, and they operate in that shadowy corridor between the defense contractors on one hand and the intel side on the other, and the corporations. So you're dealing right in that window, and this group can operate there. So when we look at the UFO file, we're looking at the advanced technology piece, the X technology piece, in combination with the UFO threat, which gives the ability to trigger continuity of government. Now we have people who are involved with continuity of government and NORTHCOM who have a direct connection in some way with the UFO file. And in the case of Saltzman, the base, and he's the Space Force commander, the base that he was at for a decade, that is the same base that had the Malmstrom incident, and it's the same one where the the Chinese balloons showed interest, and here we are in Montana again with the latest reports. So there's definitely a wave here, and it's easy to detect why over the past 5 years, the Central Intelligence Agency is trying to promote a UFO threat narrative to create a situation where they can get the media and people hyped up to this idea and then pull it off. I mean, they're not going to just do it to get data. They want to know how they can get an emergency government so that they can create a worldwide policy government. Now, the idea of the UFO threat, the piece that is maybe appealing on their side, even though it would be a very tricky thing to pull off, is that they can institute a kind of worldwide threat piece with this. So they'd have to get all the governments on board, which is something that they've been hoping to do. The problem is with the UFO threat aspect is that we don't have a UFO threat. And we certainly don't have a UFO threat on the lines of the narrative that they're cooking up. And let's face it, given the things that we've observed in relation to the UFOs, and there's incredible data that goes, it's not just the Roswell incident, it is 75, 80 years of data that shows whoever is operating this technology is far beyond anything that we could imagine. So the idea that they would suddenly turn and threaten us after living side by side with us with this amazing technology all this time doesn't add up. Also, you would need, to really go deep into the secrecy aspect, because the part of the UFO file that they're pretending to share and saying like, oh, we don't know what's going on, we're just as mystified as you. These people have access not only to advanced craft and crashes of these craft, but they've had access to this technology since the 1940s, at least. If we want to go further back, and if you come in from the exteganography angle, you've got groups that operated through secret societies passing technology along. That's where, we get so many of the things of the 1880s, the 1890s, and the airship mysteries, long before the Wright brothers and all that kind of stuff. So, if we're going to get real about it, if you're going to have disclosure about it, then you're going to have to get real about the groups that are operating and hold that technology. And with that technology, they hold tremendous advances inside the government, advances in medicine, advances in science, because the way that these things operate, like science, for example, one great scientist puts something out and lays it on the table. The next guy comes along, picks it up, and expands it. Well, if you cut the society out of the loop and you keep over here in a breakaway fashion developing this material, then that's not the same thing, is it? Instead, you get a schizophrenic situation. We have a very small group controlling very major technology, and the general run of society is sort of being herded over a cliff with threats and, hey, what's going on? This kind of thing. So that's not a very functional situation, and piercing the UFO threat can open up so much with society. I've got more here, but I'm going to work in your questions as we go. And so I will turn it all over to Miss Olivia right now.
Mike says, do you think they are preparing the fake alien invasion to distract from all of their crimes? Diana B says, does anyone else think that this is distraction from the story of medical fraud and an increasing number of awakened to reality? And Marvin says, Biden blew up the Russian pipeline to Germany, act of war and illegal. That is the biggest story being hushed. What do you think?
I mean, I'm sure that they want distractions for things, but if they're shooting down objects, even if they're doing it on their own dime, even if it's our objects that they're putting up there and shooting down, it still represents an escalation of the UFO threat, which I think, and for me, the clearest, easiest route for them to an emergency situation is the UFO file, because a nuclear situation, yes, they can get emergency powers through a nuclear situation. However, the carnage and the maneuverability of a nuclear situation for them is very troubling. A UFO threat takeover is a lot cleaner and a lot easier, and they've been preparing for it for at least 8 decades now. So therefore, I think they have a lot of the facts and details tied down. I don't think it's something that would happen lightly, you understand, but I think that they are pressing the public on this because the changes that they want to make in terms of making the public servile to a public to this biometric system that they want to bring in. And we're talking so much about it from the CBDC and the transhumanist augmentation of society, and you don't have a real gender and all these different things, represents an escalation of a group inside thinking that they can take the transhumanist piece that they're associated with and push society at this point to the breaking point, and that they can implement these things to that level. The UFO piece, I think, is appealing to them because there's one aspect about the UFO thing. There's a number of aspects. There's a great deal of cases of people who've had contact with these beings. One. Two, there's intense waves of technology that we've seen, them floating in and out of. These things can appear and disappear, and they display remarkable capabilities. And we've had human stories about, look at the Phoenix Lights, where the whole city watches this thing sitting over Phoenix for 3 days. So therefore, there's a lot of factors when we're talking about the UFO file, and that's the way that we need to speak about it. So if we think of them just as, a bunch of spaceships or something of that nature, we're missing something dramatic, or an enemy alien civilization, something that, two-dimensional. If we take the whole knowledge base of the UFO file part, there's a great deal of research that involves what they've done to hide the technology, and some of the things that happen in relation to the experience of encountering UFOs. I've pointed this out and attributed a quality to them called Apotheum. So Apotheum is a reality distorting physics that takes place when UFOs appear. So electricity doesn't work the way it normally would. People's cars stop. They miss time. When they're abducted, they go through walls. When these things land, plants don't grow. There's a number of factors of Apotheum that take place when these things appear. There's also a mystery track of secret societies who are aware of Apotheum. So therefore, this ability of advanced technology and the Apotheum piece isn't something that just came up in the 20th century, but it is on great display in the 20th century with our hyper materialist viewpoint. So here we are, and you get into the 40s and 50s, and you hear all these echoes of things like the Philadelphia experiment, and people between dimensions, and alien autopsies, and just a number of very unusual things that weren't in the cultural story before. So therefore, the Apotheum is sort of coming into view on that. And for me, the extreme secrecy of the ex-protect groups, and even the lethal secrecy, as we've seen at times all the way back to the 1950s with people like Morris Jessup, where they just eliminate them when they get too close. And they have a lot of tiers of how they do that. They destroy people's reputations, cut off their incomes, whatever it happens to be. But the ex-protect group has been very successful in keeping that story of the UFO thing as kind of, a fantasy for humanity. So even if we imagine now, as they put it out and it's real, it's still operating in this kind of superhero, evil aliens type thing. So I guess the general way I want us to go about this is to understand that they fear, the people who hold these secrets, they fear the Apotheum effect because they can't control it exactly. And I think that's how we should think about it. So therefore, they feel justified in withholding it because it gives them, one, a great advantage, but two, in someone else's hands, they figure they lose all the power that they've earned for thousands of years. So I think that starting to work the Apotheum piece into the conversation, understanding the X technology part works. And if you want to just say it's advanced technology, it's fine. The way it looks to me is somebody along the line picked up this advanced technology as part of the government program. So therefore, they developed a way to protect that and to keep it in the right hands, right or tighter hands, as George Bush would say. Yes.
Ratboy Genius, what about the green space laser beams over Hawaii that were allegedly from a Chinese satellite?
Yeah, this is interesting. That was activity. If you look at those green laser videos, first of all, when have you heard of a satellite beaming green lasers before? And in the middle of all the weirdness about the balloon to do that, somebody is playing around in relation to the skies right now. And so the shoot downs, there's a certain amount of theater with it, but it isn't the kind of thing that I would say, oh, we shouldn't pay attention to it. It's a distraction from, going after Pfizer or something. I think people should go after Pfizer, but I don't think that this should be dismissed. And I would be very cautious. I've heard this even from smart people and on different shows and things like that, saying like, oh, this balloon thing's a distraction. Just forget about it. No, it's very, very dangerous situation. As we can see, it's developed now into major shoot downs, and the players showing their faces in the middle of it, like VanHerck and Chance Saltzman, General Chance, and Trudeau and stuff. These are, when you see players like that in the middle of things, you pay attention, and it's not a distraction. In that, it might work as a distraction anyway, but it's certainly worthwhile to pierce the threat balloon that they're trying to create. Hey, I used balloon as a metaphor. What do you got?
Again, Ratboy Genius. I still wonder if China's balloon was scanning HARP activities. And what about the timing of the Turkey earthquake? Can HARP cause earthquakes?
Well, we have all kinds of modification technology that is not freely talked about. I remember the story of Nikola Tesla causing an earthquake in Manhattan in 1903. And so we have the ability to do that. Now, there are massive earthquakes in Turkey. They've had them before. So you can't right off the bat say, well, we created that. There is some unusual suggestions that a lot of people in Turkey in major political positions weren't in Turkey when it happened. That's always strange. And any kind of foreknowledge of disasters of that level, we have the ability, they have the ability to do that. I don't think that they use it all the time, for sure. But in terms of the HARP technology, look, the HARP technology, which was originally developed in Alaska, as we know, but it became not just one installation, about messing with the ionosphere and all these other things. It became a technology that's worldwide, as we discovered through the work of Alana Freeland. So there are technologies that are invisible that we don't get to see what's taking place. Weather modification is certainly one of those. And so I think it's too early to say, what China would have to gain in relation to this. What I'm noticing is the complete unreality of the story about the balloon, wandering across the United States, and then right after it, all these UAP style themes, which is really UFO threat shoot down things. But it gives them plausible deniability, because on one hand, they can say, hey, everyone get ready. It's a UFO shootout. And on the other hand, they can say, well, we never confirmed or denied what the actual thing was, So they're leaving themselves the ability to gauge the reaction of humanity on the ground. Yes.
Lucy Rain, how will the Russians see this? Surely they have some idea about this potential psyop.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Russians know a great deal about UFOs. There's a wonderful show I did with Joseph Farrell back in November, where we were talking about one of the things that Yuri Andropov did. And Andropov was interesting because he was a major intelligence figure before he took the leadership of the Soviet Union in 1983. But one of the things that he instituted a policy that all of the militaries and the the Soviet Air Force and all that had to create a central point for their UFO sightings and their UFO activity. And it was very, very advanced piece for them to be doing in 1983 on that level. What's interesting to me is just how much the Russians know about the UFO file, because if they don't know more than we do, they're certainly like within a hair's breadth and at second place on it. Um, for all we know, they could actually know it even better. But one of the things that they did in the middle of some of these Ukraine battles is they said, we shot down a UFO. That's very unusual language. And whether or not they actually had, to use the language as a suggestion, we can go on the record about this. If you want to roll those things out at us, we'll start talking about how you have UFOs. Would you like that? So I sense a lot of that. These are two powers kind of face to face with each other with a lot of secrets that they have on each other. So therefore, on the Russian side, they have such a history with the UFO file that they could sort of, pierce the secrecy around our own UFO file by releasing a lot. But the thing is, I think on both sides, whoever releases that information first loses a little bit, because then it allows the other one to know what their capabilities are. So I think in that sense, we're both locked into a massive secrecy thing, although you start to see things leak out. Like when they're saying, hey, we're shooting down your UFOs. I mean, that's pretty weird. Yes.
David Rogers, DJ, is there any truth that Russia shot down a UFO within the last week?
That was the story. And I think it was from a couple of weeks ago, but they actually said it themselves. And so the implication is, there was a UFO and we shot it down. So for me, just bringing it into the lexicon and discussing it that way is the jump, whether or not they actually shot down a UFO. And if it was a UFO they shot down, it was probably one of ours. Yes.
Shashakila, would COG be automatically in effect should something major happen at the Super Bowl tomorrow? And Melanie K says, how do we know they haven't already taken over?
Well, my feeling is to stay positive about mass events like the Super Bowl or whatever. I think we should be extra vigilant with everything that's going on. But no, it seems like the playground of this, the battleground for it, seems to have something to do with the border between Canada and the United States, and Montana and Oregon, that whole West Coast piece seems to be involved in the way that they're doing this. So that's where I would watch. And for our viewers who are in Montana, if you see things or anywhere, but particularly if you're in Montana and you see something in the sky that you don't think should be there, and you have a picture of it or a video of it, let us know. And you can send it to us or a link to it at admin@darkjournalist.com. And, if you're seeing something that is particularly unusual, or if you put it up on Twitter and just send us the link, it's a great way for us to know. I would love to be one step ahead of the way that they're reporting this. Yes.
Mr. Wolf, as weird as all of the government responses have been, I'm still leaning toward the government blaming this ultimately on Russia or China at some point. Karen Carpenter says, is China being moved into boogeyman status for us? And Koldasi says, has there been any word on what the Canadian UFO was that got shot down? Is it Chinese or something else?
Well, Trudeau mentioned that's the other thing. If they're not saying it's Chinese, they're not saying it's a balloon, they're saying it's an object. And we know the Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, yesterday said, the thing we shot down over Alaska is the size of a small car and didn't have any propulsion. It seemed to be floating, but it's not a balloon. So, the way they described it, it sounds a lot like the phony Tic Tac that the Elizondo group trumpeted when they came out. And it's interesting, too. I had a little sideshow. Here's my CIA UFO Threat sideshow starring the New York Times. You ready? So, Justin Trudeau came out and he was talking about, oh, the United States shot down with my direct orders this thing. And that was today. Now, the New York Times started covering Trudeau and everything that he was saying. And the person who was doing it was Helene Cooper. Helene Cooper writes, an American fighter jet acting on the orders of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada shot down another unidentified flying object on Saturday. Actually, what's interesting is the major news outlets that say he was ordered by NORAD to do it. And it's basically informed, hey, we're going to do this, so he didn't order anything. And then he says, I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. This is weird language. And they shot down the object over the Yukon. Now, I found her article and the way that she was portraying it strange. And I was like, Helene Cooper, gee, that name. Oh, yeah, Helene Cooper's the one who wrote this article with Leslie Kean. You have that little chimes of going back in time. Well, glowing auras and black money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program. You know what this article rolled out that Helene wrote? Well, she wrote the article that rolled out Lou Elizondo as a whistleblower, came directly out of that bad government, didn't give us the truth about UFOs, and he was an ex-Pentagon person who was fighting for truth. Someone who has looked at this, I've done my own cataloging of this, has found 26 different falsehoods in the article. And this is the thing that they gave us as the UFO disclosure with Elizondo, the CIA, TTSA, and all that. She wrote it with Leslie Kean, interestingly enough. And I wondered about her, and I was like, they're putting her front and center with the Justin Trudeau story and him saying, oh, I'm shooting down UFOs. So in the middle of all that, they started to report this, how search for UFOs helped lead U.S. government to Chinese spy balloons. So now the CIA, UFO office is helping us to find out about Chinese spy balloons. What the hell are you talking about? The U.S. intelligence community's review of UFO incidents reported by U.S. military personnel played a role in the detection of China's fleet of surveillance balloons. Wait a minute, I thought you said you couldn't detect any of the Chinese balloons because that's how they got across in the first place, and that's why you let them wander across. So now you're saying, hey, this UFO office is helping us. Let's go a little further. And let's remember the people that we're talking about here. It's this group. And you got Chris Mellon here, who was many senses the Defense Department representative, and also the Bucks for some of this. Jim Semivan, the CIA secret personnel, so secret that in 2015 you couldn't even find this guy listed anywhere. Very high level CIA figure. And of course, Elizondo, the false whistleblower, who wasn't ex-Pentagon, by the way. He was working for the Pentagon the whole time. That was the other part of the story that Helene didn't get right. But Helene Cooper and Leslie Kean, I was like, isn't that interesting? The same people who brought that to us. So it's interesting because Helene's brother is a mayor of a town in Montana. And it's very interesting. He's, popular there, and I'm sure, I'm sure he does a good job. But interestingly enough, I was looking at some of the things in the town, and one of the things that got introduced is a new UFO class at Helena College asks if extraterrestrials are among us. That story is from 2019. And I was like, okay. So we have this interesting, kind of UFO suggestions going on around this in Montana about the Chinese balloon and now these objects. And here we have Helene doing the original kind of with Leslie Kean, kind of puff piece promoting this false UFO threat idea and Elizondo and all that. And so this thing that got sold to us by the New York Times, the same people now are writing us about Justin Trudeau shooting down a UFO. How does that make you feel? Yeah, it gives you a little uneasy feeling. It does to me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Great to be here with you. So many of our friends are out there tonight, and we're doing this special report because of all the strange activity in the skies. And if you have strange activity in your skies, I want to hear about it. We're going to take a few more of your questions. We'll do about another 20 minutes here. And I do want to mention that there's another Marcel thing I want to get to before we're done here today. But one of the things about Roswell, when you go back, is the 1990s attempt at debunking it by the Air Force. And one of the things that they've always had problems with debunking in relation to the bodies, as the alien bodies in relation to the Roswell incident. So they decided to go out on a limb, and they said, you know what? It was just these crash test dummies. Those were the aliens that everybody was seeing. Come on, just forget about it. Forget about it. And what happened, in fact, is whenever they do things and go after a particular angle to debunk it, you know, they have big, big problems there. And so therefore the bodies aspect becomes very important, and the descriptions of what the bodies were, which is another interesting angle around the Roswell case. Well, Marcel, you know, let's remember, of course, I'm going to keep reiterating this, that he shares the prestige of being in the 509th Bomber Group, along with General VanHerck, also 509th Bomber Group, who is now the COG commander. Different, you know, generations and all the rest of it, but very interesting signature there. What is it we have to say about Marcel? Well, when they opened this whole UFO period, the main debunking piece that they used was what? Balloons, weather balloons. Now they're introducing this whole thing about UAP shootdown, UFO shootdown, courageous Justin Trudeau standing against the aliens. And how did they introduce it? They introduced it with the Chinese balloons. So we have kind of a bookending thing that's going on here. And we have to remember that Marcel exposed the fact that they made him pose with this false balloon, when in fact he said he saw miles of wreckage. And when he picked up the stuff, it had hieroglyphics on it, and you couldn't burn it, you couldn't bend it. You know, it was the most unusual alien material he'd ever run across. I want to read a couple of interesting things about Marcel's history, because whenever I get around this COG commander that's in place now, Glen VanHerck, I keep going back to the 509th. Marcel was a member of the 509th Bomber Group and was the chief counterintel officer in charge of security at the Roswell Army Air Force Base in 47. Anytime there was a security event, he was the guy to deal with it and orchestrate affairs on the base. In 1947, the Army Air Force Base was contacted by a rancher, Mac Brazel, who said, there's a UFO, is something strange out here. So Marcel is the first military officer out in the debris field, looking at the strange wreckage in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico. And what he said happens, actually, is that the metal itself behaves in strange ways, that he picks up some of this metal and he crumples it up and it goes back into a normal state, and it's very lightweight. So it has almost kind of magical properties, I guess you could say. The hieroglyphs are strange, and what he notices and what Brazel points out to him is that Brazel's animals won't go anywhere near the stuff. So he, having been in the only group that was capable and authorized to drop atomic weapons, and in fact was the group that dropped the atomic weapons on Nagasaki, he was in a position to know all the different materials that the United States had. So the idea that he would mistake all this wreckage for a weather balloon was always a bad cover story. It's why we have that great correction of history when he comes out in 78. But you have those 31 years in between where the story is just completely dipped underground. when we look back and we see the original lie, as it were, around Roswell, we start to take a look at it. And it's interesting because that 509th group, the next place that they moved to was to New Hampshire, to the Air Force Base in New Hampshire. And interestingly enough, the 509th group moves in 1959 to PZ Air Force Base. And what happens is the Betty and Barney Hill event happens, another major UFO case. The next place that they move to is Missouri after that in the 80s. And the person who gets trained there is VanHerck. So if you follow the 509th, I think that you're onto something. Yes.
Simone Nyman, does this not fit into the report from Iron Mountain? And Giza Death Star community says, is this the alien threat at Iron Mountain play? Yes.
Yeah, that's really true. Well, the report from Iron Mountain is kind of like, supposedly fictional. It's supposedly fictionalized version of all these elites trading scenarios for ruling the world and handling the world. And it's a real genius work. And whenever I read it, I find it fascinating. There's two interesting things that come out in that period. One is the Torbett Report, which is a whole examination of this group called DISC, the Defense Industrial Security Command, who are in charge of UFOs. And Werner von Braun is ahead of the group, DISC, and some of the agents. Their names are pretty interesting, like Oswald and Ruby and some of these people, Guy Bannister. These were people directly involved. There's also a very interesting piece in there about Roy Cohn. So in a way, I look at it as an explosive WikiLeaks type piece from 1970. I think the report from Iron Mountain's right around there too, and it has that same flavor. So someone on the inside is trying to get something out. I think at one point that they were crediting it behind the scenes. They said John Kenneth Galbraith, who's this genius economist, philosopher, and they said, he was behind it. And I wouldn't be surprised because he has that, that intellect. It's kind of like an X-share thing where he wants to move the culture forward. And he had access to some very deep information, but buried inside of that document is this whole scenario of a UFO invasion. Yes.
Patty M. Wilhelm, this is not disclosure, it is spycraft and warfare. And Kyle the White says, this is the powers that be telling Lockheed Martin to bring out the toys from the basement so they can ask for more tax dollars to fight the aliens.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. Here's the thing that we have to keep in mind. You're not going to get the truth or disclosure from the government on the UFO file. It's not going to happen. The people who think the CIA will do it are even stupider than the people who think the government would do it, because the Central Intelligence Agency, their whole job is deception and creating narratives and leading people away from the truth. Why would the CIA ever give anyone the truth? So when you have all these CIA people saying, I was abducted by an alien and I'm going to give you the CIA truth, that's the weirdest. The Gary Nolan thing, John Ramirez, that whole gang of CIA people who are also contactees, no. I mean, the whole piece with the Central Intelligence Agency and those who control that type of information, we have to understand them better. It's not a normal government organization. This is an organization that was not founded out of military principles. It was an organization that was founded in a law firm. And the idea of that law firm was to satisfy international finance. And, the people that they brought in were the ex-Nazis to establish it. So, there's that wonderful, kind of behind the scenes thing with John Kennedy when he gets into the presidency and he says, I can't believe the Central Intelligence Agency is doing the kind of things that they're doing. Who's giving them the authorization? And he realizes, oh my God, they're just running around, they're overthrowing countries. and fixing elections and doing all these other things. And they don't have the sanction of, they're kind of making up their own rules and pretending to play along with the establishment. And even the military is afraid of them. So, that is a whole piece that we look at, the extent of the tentacles of the Central Intelligence Agency. And now we find them in entertainment, in politics, in journalism. Every journalist who's worth anything is directly connected to the Central Intelligence Agency, because you can't have a career in journalism and not have that connection to the Central Intelligence Agency, because they can make or break you, because their networks are worldwide, and so they can get you the story. So if you're out of the loop, or if you write something that's not flattering to the CIA, you're out. So that's the way journalism works. So you can see we're ripe for some major reforms. But around the UFO file in particular, it's very simple. Just no CIA. That's the first rule if you want to get to the truth. Yes.
Simone Nyman, has the CIA been infiltrated by an evil alien force in the guise of AI? Is this another cosmic war?
Well, it's interesting. Let's suppose that the groups inside the Central Intelligence Agency, and we know that they exist, who are obsessed with mysticism and who know a great deal about the, secret societies and things of this nature. To me, it seems like a very, goes without saying piece that inside there are some very hardcore mystical individuals associated with intelligence. And so the idea of them trying to communicate with some off-world or interdimensional intelligence does not strike me as far-fetched at all. In fact, there are anecdotes relating to it. So I think that we should consider a lot when it comes to the UFO file, and our minds should be very open in terms of who is operating inside those intelligence circles, especially those circles that lend themselves to that kind of supernatural activity. So I guess the answer would be it's certainly open for discussion. Yes.
Lighthearted Chipmunk. DJ, can you give us some sort of future timeline, RECOG? And Summer Girl asks, will this start civil war?
Well, it's interesting. If we, I'm very retro when I look at different periods, so periods that were long before my time, I connect with, and I wonder what the conversations were like. So if people were sitting down, in the 1950s or something, and they were wondering, I wonder what is going to take place over the next 20 years. And if you think about, the Kennedy assassination is coming, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the hippie explosion, psychedelia, all the rest of it. I mean, it is impossible to predict. And I think it's very hard. I think there's a lot of pressure on people to predict things, and I think it's very hard. What I do see is the concept of deep events that Professor Scott came up with. And we've seen deep events. The deep events are caused by a group, the deep state in this case. So like a Iran-Contra or the 2008 financial crisis, where they said, if you don't give us all that money out of the Treasury, there's going to be martial law to the Congress people. The COVID operation, Iran-Contra, 9/11, things of this nature. Those are deep events. And what happens is this group that is working side by side with us comes in, the covert group comes in, they do some kind of deep event to get a policy change across the board, sometimes worldwide. And then they step back and they leave all the rubble of what they've done, and people look for the trails back to, actually most of the time people just get on with their lives and are just like, well, I don't know what just happened, but I'm going to try to deal with it. But the tracks lead back somewhere. And so another deep event is coming. The UFO file and the UFO threat being the deep event for me is in the cards. And I feel like it's pretty close. So therefore, when I see this kind of activity and I see the continuity of government players up front as the front people for it, talking about it, and also creating spin about, oh, hey, we didn't know, the balloons escaped our sensors and stuff. No way. No way. I know that they're lying. So that is unnerving. And it lets me know that their timetable is afloat, it's away. So how long does it take to become a full-fledged UFO threat operation? They've already attempted aspects of this, believe it or not. And even with the hearings that they had last summer, the tone of those hearings and the fact that Homeland Security had such a presence around that, there's a major UFO threat op, and it is false Central Intelligence Agency disclosure. Yes.
What is the exact quote that Reagan used to say about our differences would be forgotten kind of in an instant?
Oh, of course. That's his famous speech.
Exactly.
And he did it at the UN even. He said this, I think of how quickly our differences would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. We know that Reagan, behind the scenes, this came out in 2015 with Gorbachev, talking to Charlie Rose before the sex scandal got him out. And he said, Reagan took me aside at Reykjavik. This is a very important summit because they discussed a 0-point option, no nuclear weapons, 0. That's remarkable that it was ever discussed. And it was probably a really good idea. But he said that Reagan wanted to take him aside without George Shultz and all those other people around. And, with just a translator, and they're talking, and he says, will you help us, if we are attacked by aliens? So he's relating the UFO threat directly. And Gorbachev said that Reagan was absolutely serious. And Gorbachev said, yes, we'll help you. And Reagan said, good, well, because we're going to help you too. And we're going to need each other when this happens. Reagan was convinced that there was going to be some kind of an alien threat. So if you track it back, it's quite interesting because Reagan had been shown, as we learned from a number of people, but he'd been shown these ships, films of these ships. And in some cases, they were off the rings of Saturn, and he couldn't get over that they were operating there in space. And part of Star Wars was directly related to what he was seeing. So therefore, there's a lot there to unpack and consider. But Gorbachev putting it on the record, there's a reason for that. Just like Gorbachev going and making a speech at the Texas School Book Depository. Yes.
Pudding Tang, the story about the U.S. blowing up Nord Stream breaks, and now all of a sudden we've got UFOs all over the news. I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
Whoa. Yeah. Well, I understand that. Yes, because I think the Hirsch story around that has a lot. And there's no question that there were groups who were, set to make sure that that didn't happen. And the way that things are being handled over there, Europe and the whole Russian theater of war, it's unbelievable. And we need a real peace process to come forward. Where are the peace people around this? How can they allow this to continue? And you have this little Zelensky figure going around gobbling up money like Pac-Man. I mean, it's very, very disturbing. And Lockheed Martin and Boeing are having great defense contractor days, and they're inching us closer into a nuclear exchange with Russia, which is a terrible idea by anyone's. We've fought for years as humanity and through the Cold War and everything else to make sure that didn't happen. President Kennedy saved the world by getting us out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. All that to be, thrown away by this weird ex-comedian, Zelensky, who's a puppet of the Klaus Schwabs of the world. because Stepford Biden and the neocons think they can push things to the limit and consolidate the world. No, I mean, it's such a backwards thing. So, when I look at Zelensky, I see Zelensky is the enemy at this point, because the United States cannot fork money over to him with no oversight. And it was funny, Rand Paul introduced a rule. Okay, we have one person to actually count the money and see what they do with it. Oh no, that got slammed down immediately. Oh, how could you even suggest it? Don't you want to support our ally? Yeah, where's all the money going? General Zelensky. But the way I look at Zelensky, he's been dropped in there, and so much of that is, the people on the ground are suffering. And what does he want to do? Well, he wants more tanks. And, there's that whole thing about, okay, we'll send you tanks. And so Germany is sending tanks. All right. What are the memories there? Nazi tanks rolling into Russia. I mean, come on, this is terrible. These are terrible ideas. Where's the peace process? And I believe even Russia, with their own terrible move of invading Ukraine, that they're ready for some kind of peace process. And if anything, they might need it. They might need those types of motions just to get their own, hawks off their own back. So if anything, that should be where we're going. Not here's another $100 billion from a hemorrhaging economy for the new defense contractors, and we hope you kill a lot of people with those weapons. I mean, how backward is that? I hate to even put it that way. It's, who benefits except for the defense contractors and the neocons here at home? Yes.
It's a death cult.
It is. It is. Excellent point, Miss Olivia.
Okay.
Bravo.
Bobo the Clown. Does DJ think that hostile aliens are behind all these operations and the push towards a worldwide government? I know Gigi would say we're all human, but ...
Well, I mean, if you watch Gigi's interview from yesterday, actually, it's a fantastic interview, and goes over, how we've been conned in many ways with these alien actors, and the idea of, hey, there's an alien messiah that's going to lead us to glory, or there's an alien, they're demons, they're coming to take us down. Those things need to be removed from how we look at these things. The way that I look at the alien off-world aspect is I look at them as peers. And I think when you get into deeper spiritual considerations, that, when you look at the idea of angels or archangels, things like that, I don't think that has anything to do with aliens at all. But in terms of governments, look, I think it's perfectly reasonable, given the stories that we've had and the actions we've seen, that it's worth investigating the idea that there's some alternate group that is operating and making deals with our government to operate with impunity in our skies. And I think that the idea of governments collaborating with, quote, aliens is not very far off at all. And with that, 2 more questions, Miss Olivia.
Let's go back to COG for a minute.
Yes.
So Food Provider says COG leads to the bunkers sooner or later. And Debbie McAdoo says, do other countries recognize NORTHCOM? What is the international response to NORTHCOM?
Well, the first question is interesting, because I didn't mean to be putting down bunkers earlier, but what I was saying was this idea, I think that a lot of that idea that you see peddled in the alternative spaces, in the independent media, you will see this idea that if you just have enough ammo and gold and if you have a bunker, you're going to be all set. It doesn't work that way. If you actually study the way that the technology works, and this is one of the reasons they wanted to get people away from their animals, by the way, but you can see they rely a lot on infrared for detecting who's where and doing what. And the animals were disrupting that. They were like, what? We're getting this heat signature from this animal. Maybe we can come up with this idea that animals get COVID, so they're bad, and we saw some really strange trial balloons along that line with the COVID operation. But What I think is significant about that is, let's be real about it. That, if a government on that level, if we're talking about government takeover or martial law, things like that, there's no bunker on earth that's going to save anybody. Doesn't work like that. What you want to do is not withdraw from society, but engage inside the society and make it better. And if you have to form a separate society in order to do that, then that's great. But to withdraw from society, then the society loses your input. That's the only thing that happens there. In terms of NORTHCOM, look, NORTHCOM is not a true legal entity. NORTHCOM was introduced after the September 11th attacks, and it is a militarization of the North American continent. So we are still functioning, as I said, under the September 11th emergency, and there's no attempts any year by anybody to remove those powers from the government, and NORTHCOM feeds off of that September 11th emergency. The NORTHCOM commander is the same NORAD commander, as I mentioned. It's the guy we've been talking about all night, VanHerck. And he's the combatant commander under COG. He would become the ruling member of the government. He would take over, in fact, and he would appoint regional governors for different areas inside the United States. That's on the record. That's what we're dealing with. That's how far the constitutional process has deteriorated on that. Tell me that that's constitutional. But it came out of, and it has, devolved from a very, a necessary setup of emergency preparedness. So it's the exploitation of the Emergency Act. Look, if you go back to 1933 and 1934, look at the Enabling Act of Adolf Hitler. That's what makes him supreme dictator, and he can merge the office then of president and prime minister and become, nobody messes with me after that. Well, so many of these things are just a replay of the Enabling Act, and the Enabling Act, comes about because, those communists are burning down, the Reichstag, and so they can stage events to get emergencies. We've seen it over and over again, and it goes back World War One. It happened in the Civil War. It's just something that happens. And when governments get more and more powerful, the false flags get more and more dramatic. Now, I don't think that everything that happens in government is a false flag, and I don't think that every action that a government takes is against the citizenry. But I think that there's over and over again a pattern of a group of people operating inside of these institutions of the government and intelligence services and exploiting them. And when it comes to the UFO threat, they're on the precipice of attaining something by the way that they've laid this out. And so much of what we're seeing with the Trudeau thing today and all the rest of it is to introduce this idea of shooting down UFOs. Yes.
Last question.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Monocle, what is the end game?
Well, the end game is that they can't get the powers that they want through election because they're not popular enough. Look at Trudeau. He actually holds a 29%, which is probably inflated, but 28, 29% in his own voting and poll popularity there. But the way that their government is set up, he can get away with doing that and running. Stepford Biden doesn't have the necessary numbers to govern either. So what these people need with their policies is an emergency powers to implement the things that they want to do. Take, for example, the things that happened in Canada, when they pressed the emergency button when they were getting protests from the truckers. Well, they can't stand being called out for the policies that they implement, and in that case, very, very tyrannical powers. So the end game is to achieve emergency powers and to consolidate that power and to eliminate any notion of constitutionality, democracy, or the idea of a constitutional republic. And it is to repose in a very few hands, this kind of godlike power of shaping the world and then out into the universe. And they just want to kind of write off the hundreds of thousands of years of human history, and they've got their technology to do it. But for me, you know, it's like the song goes, they got another thing coming. I'm going to read this NORTHCOM piece, and we'll end on this, and unless you have another question.
No, I was just saying, John T. Thackeray says, suicide booths and smart cities.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even get into the smart cities, but you're absolutely right. That's a piece there. U.S. offers no new details of UFO shot down over Alaska as new objects seen over Canada. There's the UFO piece sneaking into the headline with it. And I find that interesting. You remember I mentioned too, I'm going to wrap up a few loose ends from this one. Remember I mentioned this Helene Cooper, who was doing the Elizondo UFO article with Leslie Kean, and then suddenly she's on the front lines of the Justin Trudeau UFO shootdown thing. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, well, you know, they tapped her because she had the experience with that article. Interestingly enough, she put out a book and she was getting called out for praising Hillary Clinton too much. She actually had to put out an article that said Hillary Clinton had nothing to do with my book about the first woman elected president. Isn't that interesting? So here we have someone who people have identified as being very close with the Hillary thing, and she's wrapped up in this UAP promotional push. I think that, as we say in the business, that's one to watch. A couple of other quick things. This was the hilarious cover of the Roswell report in the 90s. Case closed. Government says it didn't happen, so therefore, you know what? Didn't happen. I always love that. Yeah, oh, great. I'm just going to stop thinking because you said case closed. I think they said that on the Kennedy assassination 60 years ago. Well, a couple of interesting things to end on. One is, as all this stuff has been happening, I've been re-examining the Skylab story from 1978. And it's very interesting, too, because there's a lot of confusion about Skylab and what happened there. But this was the most advanced space station that was launched in the 70s. And then they let it deteriorate and it re-entered the atmosphere. They thought it was going to fall in a major city. And there's an interesting story. A lot of stories came up that I heard about you know, sort of UFO interference so that this thing wouldn't smash into a city. And there were a lot of things seen around it, but and it eventually wound up crashing in Australia. There's a story about a space station crash landed over Esperance 40 years ago, setting in motion unusual events. One of the interesting things about Skylab is it goes back to this question of what we have and what will show that we have. So in the case of Skylab, it could have been very, very dangerous had it landed on a major city, and it would have killed thousands. So we could have blasted it out of the sky, and you know, we could have used the technology that we had. But in 1978, they didn't want to reveal to the other side, you know, the Russians and the Chinese, that they had this technology. So, you know, through some behind the scenes activity, they used what I think is UFO technology to take this thing and bring it down in an abandoned area in Australia. But I think Skylab, just like the Japanese balloons in World War II, give us a frame of reference for the things that they're doing now, because whenever these things come up and the frame of reference is missing, they can get away with saying anything. Like when VanHerck said, oh, we don't know how those balloons got in. They just slipped by our state-of-the-art defenses. Well, in that case, you know, I guess you should quit your job and we should go looking for another country, because if they can get balloons in, you know, they can get anything in. So what's the point in having a military that we give $1 trillion to every year? Absolutely absurd. So a couple of quick things, though, on that. And this is on the Chinese balloon. NORAD NORTHCOM. A top military commander said Monday the U.S. had not detected previous incursions by Chinese spy balloons as they took place during the Trump administration, raising troubling questions about the security of U.S. airspace. Every day as NORAD commander, it's my responsibility to detect threats to North America, Air Force General Glen VanHerck of the North American Defense Command told reporters. I will tell you that we did not detect these previous threats, and that's a domain awareness gap that we have to figure out. All right, so this guy is the head of NORTHCOM, the head of NORAD, and he's saying on the record, "Oh, we have a blind spot when it comes to balloons, but don't worry, we'll protect you." VanHerck spoke after a massive Chinese surveillance craft was allowed to cruise along the country for days, taking in sensitive military sites along the way. Soon after the shoot down, an anonymous senior defense official told reporters that similar balloons transited the continental United States briefly at least 3 times during the prior administration, and once that we know of at the beginning of the administration. Again, there's no proof of any of that, and the officials, when pressed, couldn't ever say if it had actually come within that 12-mile distance outside. So if it was like along the coast, whatever. But in any case, highly, highly unusual. And Rick Grinnell, who served as Trump's acting national intelligence director in 2020, told the Post he wouldn't accept any such briefing and cast doubt on the Biden administration's explanation. They're scrambling to justify their lack of action, Grinnell told the Post. If they believe a bureaucrat failed to notify politicals about a national security threat, then they should demand that the DOJ prosecute the individuals for treason. Interesting. Excellent point on Grinnell's part. By the way, Grinnell went out of his way to say previously that, hey, the UFO aspect is real, and those, this is something that we should be sharing with the public. And I think what's in the back there of those comments is we shouldn't be trying to create this false UFO threat idea over here with our own technology. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up with your super chats.
Okay. Eurythmy's fun. Wait a minute, 72. Bill Gometz, Ghost Malone, Gillenjoy R, Debbie McAdoo, Les Scott, Izzy the Great, PJD, Sun Hero, Stacy Chiuli, WC Ray, Stefan Vanderlaan, Global Atlantis, Red Magnetic Dragon, Unidentified S4, Bob Bindert, M. Rice Home, Doreen Hewitt, Laura J., Prometheus Beard, Glenn Donaldson, Lighthearted Chipmunk, UFO Hunters, Happy Camper, Tish M., Irish Guy, Second Chance Recovery Channel, Pudding Tang, and Miko. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. We appreciate your support, and to all our subscribers as well, thank you for allowing us to do the deep reports that we need to do to bring you this kind of information. We will be back. We may be doing some more special reports in relation to what's happening here. We have some exciting interviews coming up, and we're also coming back next Friday with our regular show. I do want to say this to kind of round out the entire thought and episodes around this that I have when thinking about the subject matter of the UFO threat in relation to what they're doing now. The key thing to watch for in all of this are the figures of the continuity of government commander. That is Glen VanHerck. The more that they put him in the middle of UFO shootdown pieces, it means they're bringing those two highly sensitive, highly secret pieces together. One, the UFO file, and the other, the continuity of government program. For what they're doing with the shootdowns and the reports that are coming out, obviously the place to watch is Montana. And the activity has been so heavy around Montana, as I said, as we were going to do the show tonight. Right before we did, they were citing something major in Montana, and there were some things that in these sky flashes in Montana when this whole thing began that weren't investigated properly, that the government got caught flat-footed. The governor of Montana got caught flat-footed responding while he was in a live Fox TV news interview. So the UFO threat is something real. The Central Intelligence Agency has been working on it for a long time. And the idea is, that with those emergency powers, you surrender more and more of your liberties to this group. I think that they have trotted out a number of individuals over time to do this. Elizondo, of course, Gary Nolan, and others. And that is all related under the umbrella of the different ops that they're doing in relation to this. I think that should be roundly and soundly completely rejected on behalf of the independent community. And in terms of the UFO file, there's a genuine research piece, which is so important. And I think the false disclosure, false UFO shoot down, this whole thing that's going on is a very dangerous and bad direction, and should be completely and utterly, thrown off and pushed back against. And with that, I'll do a couple of shout outs for this great crowd that we got out here. Johann Wolf, it's great to see you out there. Just like that. Undestroyer. I know Gigi's out there. We just did a great interview with Gigi from yesterday. Just fantastic. You got to see it.
Is there a part 2 coming up?
Part 2 is coming, and it's equally powerful. Just a great one. And Kay Grace, Miss Honeybee, it just so happens. Let's see who else is out there. Charles Wagner, as above, so below. Thank you, sir. Isn't that true? Absolutely. Gypsy Moon, thank you. Very much appreciate it. Miguel says, great with Gigi. Yeah, that was fantastic. Nicely done. That's Gypsy Moon. Thanks for the real deal. Thanks for the caps. That's the way I look at it. Gigi, last night was the best. Interesting. Thank you all. Stefan, it's great to see you out there. Traveling Riverside, Alchemy by Angels. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. I'm so right. Thank you. That's what I like to hear, that I'm so right. Come on. Thanks for the info tonight. I know Joseph Farrell was out there. We have Joseph coming up. We're going to have a very exciting interview with Joseph shortly.
So if something goes down tomorrow night at the Super Bowl, are we going to go live tomorrow night?
There's no question we'll be on top of it regardless of what's happening. And I anticipate special reports going on all week. So I guess get the car filled up with gas. Right? Spread the truth, people. I like that. Fantastic. Lucy Rain. Exactly. That's the idea. Just in time. Karen Carpenter, Corey Anderson. Fantastic. What a great group tonight. We will see you all next week. And we may see you sooner than that with all the things that are going on. And have a great night. And of course, a great weekend as well. And, it says end broadcast after all, but it never really ends.
Never really ends.
Nicely done, Miss Olivia. Bravo.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And we'll see you all shortly. Have a great night, everyone.
God bless.